This is about my dad, Bill McRae, who flew Wellingtons in World War II and was gazetted for the DFC in 1943, and this is what was written. On the 1st of September 1942, this officer was detailed to attack enemy transport concentrations in the battle area. He bombed the target with great success, causing 2 large fires, and followed this up with a machine gun attack from 600 feet. On the 1st and 3rd of November 1942, he took part in successful double sorties against concentrations of enemy transport. Flying Officer McRae has consistently set a fine example to his crew by his fearless determination to achieve success.
How did you come to be in England before the start of the war?
Well, I worked for an Australian firm, and they decided to send me over to London for 3 years. And 3 years was about up in 1939. I was about to come home, and war broke out. And went along to Australia House and asked could I join the Australian Army, and they said, "You'll have to go back to Australia." And as a result, the man at Australia House said, "You can join the New Zealand Army here, or you can join the British Army." So I joined the British Army. And I was in that from 1939, and I graduated as a Lieutenant Royal Artillery in March 1940.
So how did you change from the Army to the Air Force?
The Air Force decided they want people to fly an aeroplane to direct gunfire. And as a result of that, I volunteered and went for 3 months to the Air Force and learned to fly a light plane. And I was ready to sort of operate, but they decided then that they had no aeroplanes or for artillery, and had no guns. They'd been lost in France. And so I decided that I would try and get into the Air Force.
So what sort of aircraft were you flying in your first training?
First training I flew Miles Magister, low-wing monoplane, had brakes and flaps, and very good little aircraft. Excellent. Very good indeed.
So how did you manage to transfer to the Air Force then?
Well, after the Army decided there'd be a year or two before we were needed, I was posted down to the mouth of the Thames at Shoebury Nest, and I got to know the man in charge there very well, who had a friend up in the War House, and he gave me a note to go up and see him, and with some difficulty they agreed that I could transfer to the Air Force.
Excellent. So did you have to go and train again then?
Yes, they sent me to train to begin with to Cambridge, which was an initial training place for aircrew. They were all more or less young boys, and that was a mistake because I'd already done the training, and all I did was march them around. And with great sort of complaints I made to people, I got transferred from there to another elementary flying school, which I'd already done. So it was all a bit of a waste of time. War was like that.
So you ended up at Cranwell, did you?
Yes, well, after my second elementary flying course, I got posted to Cranwell, and at that stage you either got posted to single engine or 2-engine planes, and Cranwell was a 2-engine plane place on Oxford, and I did my second stage of, in the Air Force you did the elementary, they did the middle thing, and they did the operational thing. Well, the middle thing I did at Cranwell on Oxford's twin-engine planes.
Yes. So how many hours did you get up there?
I suppose you did about 50 elementary, and Oxford you did another about 50 or so, I would think. I'm not sure of that. But then after that you got your wings, so you graduated more or less. And up to that stage I was still in the army. At any rate, I then transferred to the Air Force.
Right. So what sort of rank were you then?
To begin with, I was a second lieutenant, and then I became a lieutenant Royal Artillery. And when I transferred, I lost the rank. I started out in the Air Force as a pilot officer. That's the lowest rank, of course.
So when did you go on to Wellingtons?
That would have been in early 42, and I'd say about January, February 42. We were posted to Harwell, where you sort of got your crew together with a navigator, wireless operator, second pilot, and a couple of gunners, front and rear gunners. And you trained as a crew. At Harwell I trained.
Yeah. Do you select the crew yourself, or?
Yes, I'm still in touch with the navigator and the rear gunner.
Wow. Yeah.
I've talked to them every couple of months on the telephone.
Yeah. Yeah. So just by chance you came together then? You came together just by chance?
By sheer chance.
Yeah.
What happened, they posted about a dozen pilots and a dozen wireless operators and a couple of dozen gunners, and they left you there to sort it out.
Yeah.
And you just sort of got to know each other, and you decided you want to be one crew, which I don't think was very efficient. I wouldn't agree with it. I think it was just sheer luck, as war was.
Yes. Yeah.
But I had a Scottish navigator, and the rest were Englishmen.
Yeah.
And, very good people.
So you spent some hours training on Wellingtons?
Yeah, finished training on Wellingtons in about May 1942. And we thought we'd be posted to the European front, but by sheer luck, Rommel had broken through in Africa, and they sent out a couple of squadrons of Wellingtons to Africa. And they gave me a brand new aircraft and said, fly it out to Cairo. I'd say they were a bit trusting, but we flew out to Cairo via Gibraltar and Malta and Cairo. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. So that was quite a long trip. Was that dangerous at all then? Was there any...
Yeah, it was well, especially if you didn't know quite what you were doing.
Yes.
And I wasn't very good at night flying, and I had a dread of having to land at Malta in the middle of the night, which we did, which luckily I was able to do that, but I wasn't very confident. Wasn't confident at all. But then fortunately, the next day, we spent one night in Malta. With Cairo, at daybreak, we flew around the pyramids and landed an aeroplane there, which was quite a feeling of achievement, really.
Very spectacular.
Boosted my morale. No.
Yes. But then, of course, you were in action then, were you?
That was the first. They gave you the credit of flying out to Malta in your operational hour. People who are operating in the Middle East, their tour of operations was 250 hours. In England it was 30 trips, but we had to do more trips, but they weren't that dangerous. They weren't really. There were very few night fighters in the Middle East. All you were worried about there were ACACs and searchlights.
So what sort of targets were you attacking?
Mainly we were following up the army, and main target was Tobruk. Tobruk is about the only sort of reasonable port along the coast of Africa there, and the Germans were then occupying it. And I think from the canal I did about 8 trips on Cabrit, which was about 6-7 hours flying, which was quite a long time, but it was relatively, I'd say, not that dangerous.
Yes.
And again, it had its moments.
So was it you were living? What was your base? Your air base then? Were you living in the desert?
Oh yes, yeah. We were based at originally on the canal, where we were living in comfort, and then we started out at Kilo 40, which was 40 kilometres along the Cairo-Attic Road. There were aerodromes all over the place there, and that's where we operated from. We were sort of about 40 miles or 50 miles, I think, from the front line where Rommel had sort of advanced into Egypt. And you could hear the gunfire from where we were, but it was relatively, I would say, not dangerous.
And was it, were you living in tents? Was it
Oh, we lived in tents.
hot and dusty?
Oh yes, it's hot and dusty, but no great hardship. If you wanted to go into Cairo, you'd walk out to the main road and get a lift in when you weren't flying, and you could spend a day in Cairo, and you could rely on getting a lift in and out, no trouble whatever.
Yeah. So were there any pubs in Cairo or clubs?
Oh yes, the best place there, I think, was the New Zealanders had established their own club there.
Oh, right.
And you could go and have a shower and a meal, and generally they had sort of cafes and things in Cairo, and they had a very big open air place there where I'd say 1,000 troops would be having a bit of an evening out, and something I really remember about that, there was the Irish army had come out to Egypt then, and they happened to be in the cafe that night, or this big open air place, and there was a little Irish fellow got up and sang, the Yeoman of England, and the whole place, which was complete uproar, suddenly silenced, and he sang there, magnificent voice, no accompaniment, that sort of sticks in my mind.
Tell me about Alamein. What was happening then?
Alamein, we were briefed that the big do was about to start. And I remember my head Air Force fellow came out that afternoon and said the night's the night, and generate we stood by, and I think the thing kicked off, it might be 10 at night or 8 at night. You could hear the gunfire from there. And we heard the guns starting up, and so we took off about 10 or 11 o'clock. And I'd say for an operational trip it was dead easy, because we were depending on the Fleet Air Arm from Alexandria, who were dropping flares. I don't quite understand how they got in the act, but they flew on the battle area. Apparently they had better intelligence, and they dropped flares, and our aircraft would, the biggest danger was hitting another aircraft. They'd all immediately go towards the flares to drop their bombs. And the bomber went down below. He was there looking down, and I think he was aiming at transports and concentrations and things, but when you're bombing, the pilot can't see anything. The big thing about bombing, you have to fly straight and level and at a direct airspeed, otherwise your bombers go anywhere.
Yeah.
So the pilot was just concentrating on his instruments, and the bomber dropped the bombs, and he was dropping out on the flares dropped by the Fleet Air Arm.
Yeah. So you went after that, you went to Malta, is that right?
Well, we followed the army up, and we did a few trips over to Crete. The Germans were operating from Crete, and we did a couple of trips on there, or half a dozen, I think. And we followed the army up, and we dropped bombs in the airfields, and we dropped bombs on Benghazi, which was right behind the line. And suddenly, one afternoon about 3 o'clock, a message came through apparently and said 6 or 8 aircraft with a ground crew will fly to Halfway House forthwith. And I think they said the pilots would have had to have 15 operational trips. But no one up in this forward airfield knew where Halfway House was. The Halfway House was the term the Navy used, because Malta was exactly 1,000 miles from Gibraltar and 1,000 miles from Cairo. So we had to take off immediately, and that meant at dusk. We didn't fly at daylight. And I remember they told us we had to fly up to a point on the coast where there'd be a beacon flashing, and from there you'd set off to Malta, which would be 200 or 300 miles away. And I remember we took off, and the beacon wasn't flashing the right letter. And Ian had to get down in the Bombay and fly up and down the coast to decide exactly where we were to get a point to aim for Malta. Flying across the sea, the main thing in flying is the wind. The winds change, and all the way across you drop flame floats from the plane, and if you fly over a flame float from 3 headings, you can get a very accurate wind. And the navigator adjusted his wind on that. And when we got near Malta, I suddenly saw a row of lights on the horizon. I thought, I'm seeing things. I said to Ian, are we in the right place? Have we gone over to North Africa? And Ian, the navigator, the wireless operator, called up, and he called up and you get a very accurate direction from Malta, the direction to fly to go to Malta. Well, that added up, and I still, for quite a while, couldn't understand this row of lights on the horizon, which was Malta when we got there. The reason being that a convoy had gotten in, and they had all the lights on the walls alight to unload the convoy quickly. At any rate, we got to Malta, and there were a lot of planes flying around at the aerodrome. And another thing, I asked the wireless operator to get the QFE, which was the barometric pressure you set on your altimeter, which gives you a height above the aerodrome. But he couldn't get that, and so that was a bit, he didn't quite know which was the right height to fly above. But then we flew around, I'd say half an hour before we got a green to land. And the standard thing was you flew up the flare path, flew downwind, and when you flew downwind, you tapped on your Morse code, the light under the aircraft, and if it was your turn to land, you got a green from the beginning of the runway. Then you had to fly around about half a dozen times before we got a green. And flying around, I could see a fire on the aerodrome. At any rate, we finally got a green and landed, and there was a fire blazing to one side. And when we landed, we found that one of our planes coming into land had gotten off the one side of the runway where they had the big horseshoe-shaped sandbag shelters, which the fighters were putting during the day, so they could sort of take off immediately. And one of our planes I think part of the thing was they didn't have the right aerodrome height. Had got to one side and hit the one of these blast shelters and gone up in flames.
Dear me.
And they told us there that sit in your plane until daybreak. Don't get out of it, leave someone in the plane, because the locals might grab your parachutes. Which apparently happened, evidently, because the Maltese were great lace makers, and they liked the silks and lace. But then as we left, I think, one chap in the plane, and we went to the mess, and there was a party on. And I'd say there were about 20 or 30 people there, and they were all in high spirits, and we were sort of, we'd come in still wearing our flying gear, and we were sort of welcome as just arriving in England. But what had happened, the party, by sheer luck, was from a plane, one of our planes had been operating on Beaufort's, I think, bomber thing, had been shot down up in the Greek islands, and they'd been captured, and while there, they were well fed by the Italians who were in charge, and they were then put on the Italian plane to fly back to Italy. And on the way back, they overcame the Italian crew and made them fly to Malta.
Amazing.
And this was a party for the people, and it's written up in the Warriors, like, this was a party for the crew having gone back to Malta.
Tell me about some of the operations from Malta.
Yes, I'd say the one that stands out particularly, weather there was very difficult in Malta. They had no stations to report round about, and often you ran into very bad weather. And I think it goes back to the original siege of Malta in 1655, I think, or thereabouts, when the Malta was under siege. The Turks had to give up because of bad weather, which was in the end of the year when we were there. And I remember one trip we did on Sicily, I think, and weather was very bad, and there was some doubt. Often when you were flying, you found that operations would stand by for a couple of hours on end before the weather cleared. And we were briefed to bomb Palermo, which had a couple of, I think, cruisers in, and a historic city and shouldn't have been bombed. But at any rate, we briefed to take off, which we did. Ran into very bad weather, which cleared when we got round to the northern coast. And we got to Palermo, and they were very flak there, was very light, a few guns were going off, which was quite unusual because when you got to a target, you found they were all shooting at you all around. But on this occasion, very few guns, so we found out later all the other aircraft had been recalled because of bad weather, and we're the only one who bombed Sicily. But at any rate, that was, we got caught by the searchlights, and they fired at us quite a bit, but I'd say that was the most exciting raid we did from Malta. And when we returned home, we ran into really bad weather getting back again. Malta quite a small place, but wireless was very good in Malta. The wireless got us back to Malta. It's only about 15 miles by 10 miles, and you could very easily not find it, but I think wireless saved us. And when we got back, we found out all the others had been recalled, and their wireless operator, he said, well, I think we might have been the other side of, is it Mount Etna in Sicily there? And he said that might have blocked us out. But he said also there were drops of rain coming in from the bad weather on the set.
Yeah.
That might have been the cause of not receiving the message.
Oh dear. So, how long were you in Malta?
Only there about 2 months. So we spent Christmas there. We had Christmas dinner in Malta.
So was it being bombed much then? Or?
Not a lot, no. The fighters were right on top then.
Yeah.
They had a few raids, but nothing of any note. Oh no, we were right in charge in Malta then.
Yeah.
No question. And the fighter boys were right on top.
Yeah.
They were, you know, cock-a-hoop about things. And they had some big, and the big thing then was that Germany at that stage was getting besieged in Stalingrad. And we remember in Malta, intelligence told us that about 100 and 200 planes had landed in Catania, that is Sicily, the aerodrome there. And the next we all thought they were going to attack Malta, or we'd have to attack them. And they suddenly all disappeared. Apparently they'd gone to Stalingrad, where Germany was in real trouble there.
So how did your tour come to an end, and how did you get to be in the training unit? How did that happen?
Flew back to Cairo,
Yeah.
did one last trip there, and then posted back to England. To get back to England, we flew down to Khartoum in a flying boat, and then we got on a DC-3 and flew over to West Africa to Accra, and there we got aboard we got aboard a small ship there, took us up to Freetown, and there we got on board the Mauritania, magnificent boat, and took us back to Liverpool.
Excellent.
What a trip.
Pleasant, very pleasant war there.
So was it a relief to be away from the action?
Real relief. I mean, flying operationally was a big worry.
Yeah. So would you have been frightened going out to missions? Was it very frightening, or?
Very frightening.
Yeah.
I mean, every time generally we flew around a target before, you had an hour to go in and drop your bombs. A blitz hour they call it. And you'd fly, you arrived a bit early, you'd fly around and an odd gun would be firing at you, but then you had to fly in and drop your bombs, and to do that you had to fly at a very steady height at a very safe speed and to get accurate bombing. And that's when the enemy knew that you were going to fly over the target. That's when they set up all their ACAC and their searchlights. And I remember when you came out, your mouth was completely dry.
Yeah.
And
Complete fear.
did they lose many Wellingtons?
Middle East, not a lot.
Yeah.
The odd one, only the odd one.
Yeah.
Not a lot, oh no. I'd say operating out there was comparatively safe as compared with Germany.
Yeah.
I only saw one night fighter out there, because I think they had no. For night fighters, got a very, very elaborate radar setup to direct the night fighters, and they didn't have that in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So did you sustain any damage?
Yes, yes.
What sort of thing happened?
Well, when I was, after I got back to England, I was in a training operational cruise there, and some fellow got a decoration or a posting or something, and we had a big party for him that night.
Right.
And at 2 in the morning we cleared the mess and put 2 chairs up as goalposts, and we played football. And I had a couple of fellows on my shoulder, and a couple of people took me around the legs, and at my war injury, I could hardly walk. I was hobbling round, and you'd go into a pub in England, and the crowd would part to come in and want to buy you a drink. That was my war injury.
Yes, so there was a bit of luck involved.
Completely.
Yeah.
Jeff, the rear gunner, got a bit of shrapnel in his leg, which he didn't report, because if you reported he'd been made sick and couldn't go. If you lost your crew, you'd get posted somewhere else.
Yeah.
So he didn't report his injured knee.
So did you sustain much damage to the aircraft at all?
Oh, I had a few holes put in it here. Nothing of any note there.
And were they reliable aircraft?
Not particularly, because at that stage the old Wellington had been sitting out in Egypt for about at least 6 months. And out there you had sandstorms. And it was a miracle to me they ever flew, because you'd get in your plane after a sandstorm and be covered in dust.
Yeah.
But the engine seemed to go quite well, and when we got to Malta, though, the engines were, you'd find you're having trouble getting the undercarriage down, and had to land a couple of times without flaps, and once I lost the oil pressure, and I'd say they were worn out by then.
Yeah.
And they'd been out in the sandstorms for 6 months.
So you were dropping bombs from what sort of height?
Normally it dropped from 8 to 10,000.
And
The higher you are, the safer you are from the flat.
so it didn't carry a very big bomb load, though, did it?
Depending on your petrol.
Yeah.
Depending on when we bombed the Brook, I think we were carrying 6 500-pounders. And when we were going from Malta squadron trips, I think it had about 8 500-pounders. And oh no, it was relatively safe as compared with Europe.
You bombed Malta. You're not supposed to do that, are you?
And I look back, and generally there were planes out, a lot of planes flying. You had to circle around at night for 20 minutes maybe before you got green from the flare path. And I was flying around and suddenly one engine started to, flying a twin, you get it on the rudder. You suddenly feel your rudder move, which means one engine not pulling its weight. And I looked down, I felt it on the rudder, and I looked down on the roads were flickering. And I thought, well, one engine apparently is sort of losing power. So I was flying around Malta, and I suddenly decided we hadn't located the target, and in Malta you brought your bombs back. And we were flying around with the bombs, and I suddenly saw the engine going a bit, and I headed out to the coast, and I saw the coastline with the waves, and the pilot up and above there was a jettison toggle. You had to open the bomb door doors, and you could pull the thing, the pilot could drop all the bombs together. So I dropped all the bombs, and they landed just off to the coast in Malta.
So you had to fly down on one engine, or did the engine keep
Well,
going?
it picked up a bit, it wasn't gone.
Yeah.
It was still going, but incredible small, short world story. When we got back to Malta about a month or two later, we were waiting to come home to get on a plane to go down to Catania. I volunteered to go out in an aerodrome there to act as a pilot, a control pilot on the aerodrome with a lamp to direct traffic. And shared a tent with a fellow there, and told him I'd been in Royal. He said, oh, said the bloody bombers did. I was there in hospital. He was a PRU pilot. He was in the hospital over on the coast of Malta. It was about 2 o'clock one morning. Said there was an enormous explosion. This was the fellow hit me there, and I jumped off.
So did you confess?
Yes, I told him.
That's amazing.
He was an American, quite to say this to you.
Yeah.
But they were on PRU Spitfires. They're high-flying Spitfires that take photographs.
Yeah, photo
And
reconnaissance.
they were based on this aerodrome. I volunteered to go out, sort of fill in time there. I think the canal then up to Tobruk. It was a long way, and we were flying along, not that high, we were flying at 6,000 feet, I think, and flying along the coast, and Ian, the navigator, he went down into the Bombay where you could look down to look at the coast and sort of check up where we were. And Ian was down in the Bombay, and he said, hey, he said, there's a balloon barrage down below. I said, oh, bloody crazy. See, yes, there is. So I banked the aircraft right over and turned around and had a look. Sure enough, there were 4 white things that looked like balloons. And then I realised it was anti-aircraft gunners firing at us, and this was the right explosion. It's down below. So I've had a head on about that ever since. The night we saw the balloon barrage. But the balloon barrage, I said, oh, you silly to imagine that. We were training the French crews up at Lossiemouth in northern Scotland, and every couple of weeks, General de Gaulle would send up from London a cask of red wine for the French air crews.
Just one.
Eh?
Just one.
Oh yeah, just one. That wasn't very good wine. But at that stage, the intelligence officer, every station had an intelligence officer, and there was a fellow in charge of all the intelligence officers in the area, all the aerodrome, and he came round on a visit. And of course, he visited our station, and he stayed for lunch. And the French people there insisted on giving him some red wine. He was an elderly gentleman, and he was somehow related to the Queen, according to rumour. I don't know whether that was right. But he had a very red face, and he liked his grog. We gave him whiskey to begin with, and then the French gave him red wine. Then we had dinner, and after dinner you helped yourself to a coffee at a tray at the entrance to the mess. And he got up to get his coffee, and he fell over and sat on a cup, got a great gash in his behind, which he had about 4 stitches.
Okay, Dad, can you tell me about your medals? That one?
That's Distinguished Flying Cross. You get that for operation of flying, and I'd say the other big thing about that is you're on the winning side. I got that mainly for operation in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. You're on the winning side, and the commanding officer, you're very friendly with him. That's how you got the Distinguished Flying Cross.
I suspect there could be a little more to it than that.
Not really. No, that's the main thing.
What about that one?
Air Force Cross, you got that. That's a non-operational thing. You got that. I got that for flying training bomber crews for a couple of years, and a couple of things there you did which got mentioned, I'd say. Mm-hmm. And one was up an area, I don't know who introduced, but I introduced the Air Force up an area, touch and go landings. Uh-huh. Prior to that, you landed and you had to taxi around and start again. I think I introduced there, with a bit of objection from the headquarters people, that you touched down and you opened your throttle and took off again. Right. You were able to do about half a dozen landings an hour instead of about 3.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think I introduced that in the northern part of the area there. Whether it happened elsewhere, I don't know. Mm. But there was quite a bit of discussion about it before they let us do that. Mm. They only let us do 3 of those, before you had to land and stop when they inspected your tyres to see the tyres weren't going.
Well, that's impressive.
I think that might have helped.
Yes.
Otherwise, you had to know your CA very well, and he was an Australian. And I got very friendly with him too.
And again, I would say I think there's more to it.
Whom you knew, that was the main thing.
What about that one?
They're all campaign medals.
All of those?
The last one is serving in Malta.
Uh-huh.
That's the one you got for serving in Malta.
Right.
Other than those are just service medals, you know, when you're at war. So.
And what about the rosette there?
That means you operated during Alamein.
Okay.
Yeah. However, I'm not a believer in medals anyway.
People are very interested in them. I've noticed that whenever you wear them.
I suppose due to my old age, that's the main thing.
Do you think your crew were very brave people?
Oh yes, I think the people in the war who had the worst end of the stick were the crew. I mean, the pilot was completely occupied the whole time. You know, had no thoughts about anything else but flying the aeroplane. But the crew was sitting inside, sweating, I'd say, and that'd be very tiring. But the pilot was too busy to be worried, I'd say.
Were there any crews who cracked up or didn't want to go?
No, I'd say the whole time I was in the Air Force, I only struck one person who went LMF. Yeah, LMF is lacking moral fibre. And that when I was training crews at Lossiemouth. A chap there, he didn't want to go solo night flying. And the other, I was in charge of the squadron there, and I took him up and I did about 10 landings at night with him. And he still didn't want to go solo. And so next day, he just disappeared. He went along to the adjutant and said, "I can't take it." And if you go LMF, you've got peeling potatoes for the rest of the war.
So do you look through this much?
No. Haven't looked at it since the wartime.
Really?
Oh, no.
There must be amazing memories. So how many hours did you have altogether?
Oh, only about 1600, 1700.
Yeah.
You didn't get much hours.
So how did it all end when the war was over?
I went back to work again at the end of the war because they had no staff. The English staff didn't volunteer, they waited to be called up. So there was no one in London office when the war ended. They didn't get released for another 6 months. They went back, I was working night and day.
So what were you actually doing?
Oh, more or less clerical work. I'd say there was a big rejuvenation in trade, and the main thing in London, they were negotiating, if you know that term, bills for goods sent out to Australia. And there was an enormous upsurge when the war ended. You were sort of treated as a VIP in Bomber Command, and you were issued with cartons of bloody orange juice when you went on operations. And the joke among aircrew was, always drink your orange juice on the way out.
Just in case. Thank you, Bill.
And you always got eggs and bacon at night too. I'd say in Bomber Command, you're walking on water in England. I'd say it went to a lot of people's heads, really. And I think they sort of were looked upon as sort of bloody heroes, everyone.
A lot of people still think they were heroes.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, thank you very much for the interview anyway. It's very interesting stuff.
Oh, no. Very minor. And during the war, you were just like an ant. And dashed in and did what you were told, and that was it. And the big thing was, I think, morale was boosted all the time by the civil population. I remember you leave on when your air crew up in northern Scotland there, you'd get 14 days every 3 months. And you'd come down on the train, you could sometimes, didn't worthwhile getting an airlift, you never knew whether it was reliable. You always caught the train down, but invariably in the train they had bottles of water and glasses in those days in the train. But a couple of old boys would come up and start talking, produce a flask. By the time we got to either London or coming home, you got home, you were half drunk. Gentlemen offering you whiskey from a flask.
Excellent. Yeah, good. Good stuff.